God. And thank you, Neela. That was great. I'd like us to think about that passage this morning. As we do so, can I just ask, how many of us find it interesting to either read about or watch on maybe documentaries on the television? What was going on behind the scenes in some of these big world events that have changed everything? You know, you've got the big event going on, and I find it so interesting to look with hindsight afterwards back at not what we all saw, or people all saw, but what was going on in the background. Because what was going on in the background that really determined the outcome and made the result, however it turns out. And in a sense, that's what we've got in this chapter this morning from 2 Chronicles chapter 9. It's what was going on behind the scenes of the event that we looked at last week from 2 Kings chapter 18. And those of us who were here last week or watching online will remember that Hezekiah, who we know as good King Hezekiah, was made king of Judah, the southern kingdom. Israel and Judah were separated at the time, and Israel went into captivity, and he was king of Judah. And he was a good king, but his father before him, Ahaz, had been a dreadful king. His father had allowed worship all over the country to all sorts of other gods in all sorts of other places. So he made those sanctuaries here, there, and everywhere scattered around about. There were pillars erected for places of worship to other gods. There were the Shiva poles, sort of fertility god worship around the place. All this had happened. And what we saw last week is that Hezekiah, when he came to the throne, put a stop to all that. He said, look, if you're wanting to follow God, then that's got to stop, and you can't do that, and that's got to go. And that's, if you like, what everybody looking on saw. What we've got in this passage, though, is the behind the scenes, what was going on. And if we think about the big picture, what everybody saw, actually, it could have come across as quite negative. Think about it. That's got to stop. You can't do it doing that. That's all wrong, and you're cutting that out, and they're going, and they're negative. Now, he was absolutely right. It did all have to go. You can't be worshipping God, the true God, and having all those things going on. Yes, it had to go. But what we see going on here behind the scenes is the positive. The positive. There always has to be a positive alternative. Without the positive, in terms of our relation with God, then all religion and religious zeal and fervor just becomes oppressive and negative, and no, you can't. So the behind the scenes was really important. And verse 3 really tells us what it was. It says there, in the very first month of the first year of his reign, Hezekiah reopened the doors of the temple of the Lord and repaired them. That was his alternative. It wasn't just you've got to stop that, you've got to stop that, and you've got to stop that. It's now the temple doors are opened. They've been restored. You know, over the years, how many churches have concentrated on the negative without the focus on the positive? And therefore, churches have got a reputation of places of you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you can't do the other. Now, the behind-the-scenes account we've got here today is very much on the positive. In fact, the whole chapter is phrased and framed in the positive. Look at how it begins. We know from last week, we thought about how Hezekiah had a father who was yet this dreadful king, who allowed all sorts and encouraged all sorts of evil in the land. But he also had a mother, and the mother was the daughter of a priest. And we thought last week about what a positive influence she had been, because Hezekiah had at least had the opportunity of growing up, knowing the things of God. notice how our chapter starts. It tells us about his mother, the positive. Ahaz, his father's not mentioned. There's not a mention of his father. This chapter is very much on the positive. And the actions were that Hezekiah opened up the doors of the temple right at the beginning of his reign, before he got rid of all the sanctuaries to other gods, before he smashed the pillars of the sanctuaries, before he removed the Asherah poles. In the first month of the first year of his reign, he opened up the doors of the temple. And what we're also told is he gathered together the priests and the Levites. And gathering them together, what he said to them, in our version it says, to purify themselves, to make themselves pure. Some commentaries, some sort of versions of the Bible, rather, they use the word to consecrate themselves, to set themselves apart for the service of God, to make themselves what they should be, to focus on their role. And of course, priests and Levites were the people who God had originally chosen to lead the worship in the temple, by their actions, to make it possible for others to come in and to worship God. Now, the temple in Jerusalem was the place where people used to do that. And in the temple in Jerusalem, that's where offerings were made for the sins of the people, so that the people could come to God. That's where there were lights kept permanently burning, representing prayer, this ongoing prayer. And what Hezekiah was basically saying is, for others to be able to come in and worship in this place, if we're opening the doors, you, as God's chosen people, chosen for that work, to make it possible, you've got to be doing your role. You've got to purify yourselves. You've got to look at your own lives. You've got to change. You've got to be the people God wants you to be, serving him to make it possible for others to come in and experience worshipping God as well. That being the case, I find a really helpful verse is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 2, obviously, from the New Testament, the Apostle Peter writing, and it says there this: you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Now, when Hezekiah got the Levites and the priests in the Old Testament together, that's what he was telling them to do, to be that light to the nation, to be those who, having encountered God's goodness, could share it with others. That was the role of the priests and the Levites. But of course, 1 Peter chapter 2 is written in the New Testament. It's written to the New Testament church. It's written for us. We are all God's holy people. We're all people chosen by God to serve him. And therefore the calling is on all of us to purify ourselves, to look at our lives, to make ourselves holy, to commit ourselves to the service of God, so that others, seeing our lives, seeing our reality, seeing our worship, can be drawn to him. It's opening the doors to all. How many of us have heard people in churches saying things like, this society in which we live is so evil. Oh, there's so much of immorality going on. There's these immoral relationships, and there's greed, and there's selfishness, and it's all wrong. And they're absolutely right to say that, and we're quite right to challenge these things. But first, we've got to focus on ourselves. We've got to make ourselves the people that God really wants us to be. We've got to commit ourselves to purify our lives, to renew our commitment to Christ, to follow him, to be the people that he would want us to be. Now think about it. What is central in our lives? The priests in the temple were to relight those lights that represented prayer. What is prayer to us? Is it just a minute or two of a morning? Or is it more meaningful than that? What is our worship? Is it real and sincere? That opens the doors for others to come in and to worship? In our chapter this morning, before correcting all that was wrong, Hezekiah set about opening the doors of the temple so that everybody could come in and worship. As we think about that, I think there's a very helpful image in the book of Revelation, the early chapters of Revelation. We've got the letters to the churches. And in Revelation chapter 3, two churches particularly stand out that are mentioned in relation to the door and whether or not the door is open. The first one is the church in Philadelphia. Now, the church in Philadelphia was a small church. It was a struggling church in many ways, but they were committed to Christ. They were, despite the many struggles they had, they were doing their best to follow him, to live obediently to his word, and were struggling, but were trying. They were described as, to them, the door was open. They had access to God. They had this real relationship with Christ, even though they had all these struggles. The other church was the church at Laodicea. Now, Laodicea was a much bigger place. It had a much bigger church. And they were a strong church. And they were confident in themselves and what they were, and knew that they were a strong church. But on analysis, they lacked that commitment to Christ. They're described as being dead. And what it says in the letter to them is the door is closed. They've lost that real relationship to Christ. And why I say that image is helpful is that little section of those two churches ends with Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, which a number of us might know quite well. It's the verse that says, it's Jesus talking to that church at Laodicea, and he says this, "Look, I stand at the door and knock. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and share a meal together, and we'll share a meal together as friends." What he's saying is, look, if you let me in, the door will be open, and you can enter that relationship with me. That relationship that will then open the door to others. You know, that verse from Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, is often used, I always say misused, at times in evangelistic talks. You know, people saying to the person who's never come to Christ, Jesus stands at the door of your heart and he knocks and he says, open the door. I say it's misused because it wasn't said to non-believers. It was said to the church at Laodicea. It was said to the church that had lost that real connection with Christ. The call is to open the door. What we see in our chapter this morning is before any correction of what was wrong outside, Hezekiah, the good king, opened the doors of the temple. You know, this morning, St. George's, in many ways, we are a strong church. Yeah, we're very good, I think, at seeking to change where change is due and to change things in the world if we can. We're quite good at trying to challenge what's not right, and rightly so. But it's always worth asking ourselves as a church and us as individuals, what is our relationship really like with Christ? Are we those in that real living relationship? Living in the open door we have to Christ that opens the door to others.